Alrighty, Rue, the time has come. Solving equations algebraically. What that means is we're going to solve either by factoring or by square rooting. We are not going to graph. We are not going to rely on a graphing calculator. So we need to study each equation carefully to decide which method is the best one to use. Now, taking a look at this, I see I've got a 4a squared, an 11a, and a 6. So I don't have vertex form because I don't see parentheses squared, and I don't have a case where there's no linear term, okay? Keep in mind that this right here, this is the linear term, okay? So that's my linear term. So that means this is going to be best solved by factoring. So we're going to factor this one, which means it has to say equals 0. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is subtract over the 11a from both sides. Sometimes you'll have like terms to work with, and other times you won't. This case, we do not have like terms to combine. All right, and now I need to work on factoring this, okay? So I'm going to break it down into two binomials. And here are some things that I noticed to help me with my guess and check. 1, there's no GCF involved. 2, I see that, I have a 4 and a 6, okay? And if you think 4 times 6, that's 24. So it's like I need factors of 24 that add up to this negative 11 here, all right? So factors of 24 that would work would be a 3 and an 8. But I can't just use 3 and 8 because I need to end up with a 4 out in front. So you have two options. You could do a 2 and a 2. But if I do that when I FOIL, I'm going to get an even number when I do both the outer and the inner. So a 2 and a 2 aren't going to work. I'm actually going to need a 4a and a 1a to make this work. And then I really need factors of 6, but one of them is going to get multiplied by 4. So keep in mind that this 8 is really 4 times 2. And there's the 4 that matches this 4. So I'm going to put the 2 over here so that when I multiply these, I get an 8a. And then when I multiply these, I need a 3a. So I put a 3 here. And they're both going to be negative because negative 3 times negative 2 will give me positive 6. And then I'll get a negative 8a and a negative 3a to give me negative 11a. Okay? So that was a lot of talking about it. But once I do that, I'm going to just take each factor and apply the zero product property, which says, 4a minus 3 is equal to 0, and a minus 2 is equal to 0. So I'm going to add over the 3 and get a is equal to 3/4. And I'm going to add over the 2. And you can write it as two separate answers if you would like. Or you could write a equals and write it as a list, 3/4, comma 2. All right, either set of answers would be fine. So there's a solve by factoring. In order to solve by factoring, it must be standard form equal to 0. Okay, so there's a factor. Now let's slide over to problem number 2. Problem number 2, I want to study the equation and decide factoring or square rooting. Which one would be more efficient in this particular situation? Now here's what I notice. I've got a squared term. This is a number, and this is a number. This one has no linear term, meaning there's nothing that's just a plain c because the variable is c here. So what that means is I can actually solve this best by square rooting. So my goal here is to try to get the squared thing by itself. So see this right here? I want it by itself. So the first thing we're going to do is take away the 25 from both sides to get 4c squared is equal to negative 32. And now I could square root both sides right away, but it'll be better if I get the c totally alone. So I'm going to divide out the 4 and get c squared equals negative 8. Okay. Now I'm going to introduce a square root. Now this is something that's new to us. When you introduce a square root into an equation, you must factor in that there are two possibilities, a positive and a negative. Like if I think about the number 9, the square root of 9 is 3, but the square root of 9 is also negative 3 because negative 3 quantity squared gives me positive 9. So when you introduce a square root into a problem because you're solving an equation, that's when you need a plus or minus, okay? We talked about it a little bit back when we were talking about imaginary numbers, but then we said we're going to talk about that later in the next chapter. Well, it's later, guys. All right, so on the left-hand side, we're just going to end up with c equals, and on the right-hand side, I have plus or minus the square root of -8. But the very first thing I need to do when I see the square root of a negative is make it I square root of a positive, okay? We cannot leave square root of a negative in an answer. And then I can even break this down further because this is 4 times 2. There should be an I here, my bad, my sincerest apologies. So I'm going to get c equals plus or minus, the square root of 4 is 2, and then I, and then I have the square root of 2 left over. So this is my final answer. And also, by factoring in this plus or minus sign back here, I don't need to worry about the absolute value piece because I'm already factoring in the positive and the negative solution. So don't worry about anything absolute value here. No absolute values involved, okay? So there are our first 2 examples. We're going to go through a few more in the next 2 videos. See you there.